about ready to kick off Ace Comic-Con Long Island with our very first panel, Off the Page Justice League. It's a little movie that got released about a week ago. You may have heard of it. We're going to discuss some character evolution from the page, the comics, the original run of comics, all the way to the film that was just released. And to do that, we've gathered a panel of some people who are pretty intimately acquainted with this source material. Dan Jurgens. Yes, please. Keith Giffen. And Liam Sharp. And I am your host, Alexandra August, in case anyone's wondering. So gentlemen, I'd like to start by just getting a brief history of your acquaintance with Justice League in general, for anybody who's not as familiar with your work as we are.
My first experience with Justice League as a reader or as a pro? Let's start with as a pro. My first experience with Justice League, honestly, is a story that has never appeared in print. Julie Schwartz asked me to draw a Justice League story way back in the early 80s, and to this day it had never appeared because Julie at that time was preparing a lot of inventory material. And yes, I still have some of the pages, and from time to time talked to Dan DiDio and said, you should print this, it's cool. After that, I wrote and drew Justice League of America. After this young fine gentleman right next to me for about 25 issues around 1991 to 94, somewhere in there. Oh, and Justice League International. I wrote that too. That was like 2011. Sorry. Next up.
Dan said everything I was going to say. No, I came onto Justice League after Justice League Detroit. DC was looking for something new to do with the book. So they just handed us a bunch of characters, and we played it fast and loose, and it's become kind of known as the Bwahaha Justice League. So I stayed on it for a while, and then left. I don't know.
And launched like 15 other Justice League books during that time.
No, I'm only talking about the ones I was involved with.
Well, they were all because of you.
No, they were.
You were there.
Well, I wasn't doing it alone. I had DeMattis on board and Kevin Maguire, but yeah, for a while there, Justice League was doing pretty good.
Justice League Canada, Justice League Australia.
Justice League Australia, Justice League Europe.
Justice League Zimbabwe.
Justice League Antarctica.
Yeah.
My favorite.
Everything.
Yeah. Who's this guy?
Yeah, I'm the new kid that snuck in at the end. I've just come off a run of Wonder Woman, which is really the big association with the film and the characters and everything. The Justice League appeared right at the end of my last issue, and then I got asked to do an issue just before I start The Brave and the Bold, which is also Wonder Woman and Batman. So I'm sort of becoming more and more intimately acquainted with this family of characters. So yeah, that's me.
Oh, thank you. So as to this isn't the first time Justice League has been adapted into an on-screen version. There have been obviously cartoons for years and years, the original Hanna-Barbera, and along with several television shows as well. How have you guys followed the evolution of some of the characters that you've worked on throughout the various adaptation of the comics?
Well, yeah, certainly, and it's always been interesting to see how it has evolved. In a way, you have some characters like Superman or Batman, Wonder Woman that showed up before and actually even predated the concept of the Justice League. So you can go all the way back to the stuff they did in the 40s in terms of film, things like that, and then track that all the way through now. So you go back to the days with just the cotton bodysuits, and now they have the body armor type clothing and everything else. It's been interesting to see.
I'm a little bit at a loss because all the characters I used in Justice League, with the exception of actually Batman, were characters that DC allowed me to use. There was they gave us characters initially in the first place, and then they kept yanking them away as they realized what we were doing, until finally we had to go to the Global Guardians to get the characters. So most of the Justice League members they're using right now, I was told to stay away from.
I feel like there's a story there. We don't necessarily have to hear it. I'm just thinking that. But.
Yeah, I'm just glad that Wonder Woman is no longer their secretary. You know?
So am I. So speaking of evolution, though,
Got off pretty easy.
how have you do you think that there are themes that have been constantly enduring in the Justice League that have remained pretty consistent since the comic's inception to their iteration today, or do you think that there are themes that have actually changed, like, or are the bones of this team pretty much this team and their mission pretty consistent?
Well, I think there has been one root sort of concept that I think has always run throughout Justice League with one exception. And the concept has basically been Earth's greatest heroes, or their 6 or 7 greatest heroes, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Flash, whatever. And that has always been the core of the League, except for when you were doing it, because you found a way to do a very successful Justice League, a crazy successful Justice League, without doing that.
Well, it's not that I found a way to do it, it's that I wasn't allowed to actually use a lot of the DC characters, because the minute they realized we had a sense of humor in the book, they got really nervous about it. As an example, when we launched Justice League Europe, we had Wonder Woman for all of 10 pages before she was yanked off the book. They didn't trust what we were going to do with it. But so we worked with a lot of secondary characters and saw what we could do with them.
You know, understand a part of it is...
What do you have to say about it?
I'm very curious to have seen what you would have done with Wonder Woman. I probably wouldn't have approved being the sort of new, having been part of Greg Rucka's run and the very kind of strong and important reinvention of that character that's happened recently. But, you know, being a fan of the crazy stuff you did back in the day, it would have been highly entertaining.
We weren't interested in them as heroes. We were interested in what happened when they took off the masks and tried to relax. So it wasn't exactly a standard Justice League book.
No, but it was one that the world was definitely ready for at that time. Yeah.
It succeeded. We were so confident it would succeed that before the first issue sales came in, I was looking for another job because I thought I'd ruin my career by doing Justice League like that. Mark DeMatteis was looking for another job. Kevin was showing his portfolio around, so no one was more surprised than we were when it actually came in and turned into a hit.
Yeah.
So, we've seen the DC Extended Universe kind of grow and grow and move towards the pinnacle of this now Justice League film. How have you seen the story evolve? How's the story evolution to get to Justice League been similar to what you've seen in the comics? Or do you feel like it's a completely original beast?
I never really gave it a lot of thought. We were handed the characters. We knew what Justice League had been. We knew the basis of Justice League, that they are supposed to be Earth's premier heroes. And as long as we didn't go too far from that or make them too dark, we were okay. I mean, I never really got a lot of backlash from DC about how we were handling the heroes.
Yeah, I think the Justice League, no matter which 7 or 8 characters are in the League at any given moment, are always like Earth's last line of defense. And theoretically, it's sort of like a threat comes along, Superman can handle it, or Wonder Woman could handle it until it goes to like level red, then you need the entire League kind of thing. And I think throughout their existence, that's always been the way they've kind of worked. Even with Keith's cast.
No, I want to hear what he has to say.
Yeah, Keith's pressing me on what my view is on all of this. You know, I think right now the iteration in the comics and the film versions are closer than, well, they're pretty close actually, tonally and in terms of what the characters are meant to represent. So I think, you know, particularly Wonder Woman, she was pushed more to the fore as a leader in the film and as a character in the comics, which is good. I really enjoyed the interaction between the characters in there. It's really, it's funny coming from doing the series of one character that you get very, very close to. And I almost couldn't imagine her in the rest of the DC universe. I know. Got slapped there. Somebody edit that out.
I imagine that's not going to be the first time this happens this weekend. There's a lot of crossover.
I became so sort of enamored with her being sort of an independent character that it was almost a shock to me when I got to the last issue and suddenly all these other, major characters are turning up: Batman and Superman and Flash, and I was like, oh man, I've got to get to know these guys. I didn't know them. That's the thing, you get like when you work on a character, you become friends with them in a way. You kind of get in their heads a little bit, and
do you know from here we can't hear a single thing you're saying? You sound like a drunk in a bar muttering in a corner. All we get is
I was thinking the same for you guys.
Weird feedback.
It is a fun part of sitting on a stage with microphones. You get to hear the echo, and I can kind of hear what you guys are saying, so I apologize if I repeat a question. I am trying to listen.
We apologize for all the swearing. It went right past you.
Oh man, we've been pretty good so far.
I just thought I'd speak in Klingon.
Yeah. I have no idea what you just said.
Something that I'm always curious about when getting the chance to speak with creators such as yourselves is, do you have favorites? When you're writing for an ensemble piece, is there just someone, like you said, you get to know these characters, do you get to know and love any particular one? Is there one that really, really, really makes you angry, or that you just don't like living inside their head? I'd love to know some of your personal feelings about these people.
Yeah, obviously for me it would be Superman is one that I really enjoy writing. When he was in the League, Booster Gold, sometimes you touch base with a character somehow where you just build that connection. You intuitively know what they're going to say. For other ones, like Green Lantern, the Hal Jordan version of Green Lantern, it's always like, to me he seemed very bland. So it's like, how do you make him not seem bland yet not change the character? And so I always had a bit of a hard time with Hal. And I think the trick of writing a book like that is to always find a way to differentiate from among the 7 different personalities somehow. Because in a way, when you take that group of 7, they do tend to be a lot of like. And I think the most successful writers have always found the little tiny ways that are there to separate Hal from Barry, from Clark, from Bruce, from Diana, etc. And that's when you have it working.
The characters I related to most of all when I was doing Justice League were Beetle and Booster and Fire and Ice, because we just built the characters, turned them into almost like a buddy book. Beetle and Booster were like a buddy movie, and Fire and Ice were just 2 characters that went well together. I never really connected with Batman or Superman or any of the major characters. I was always drawn to the ancillary characters.
I'm sort of just coming back to the mainstream again after a long time, and I'm having the best time because, I don't know, I guess because I had a long time away from them, the sense of this, the history has more of a bearing than I previously had kind of been aware of, being young and kind of, gung-ho. From that point of view, it's, I don't know, there's a kind of sense of like, I've got to be respectful of these characters. I know it's fun to really kind of mess with them and play with them and everything, but I think all writers and artists put themselves in their work, and that the work, it becomes a kind of weird extension of who you are. So that's why sometimes the time you spend with the characters is what makes them special ultimately. That's where they get depth over time. But in the Justice League issue I drew was just a full-on adventure story. So it was all of the characters having sort of big fights with crazy kind of, either monsters or,
okay, what did you just say? What did you just say? Tell me what he just said.
Because I'm English, isn't it? That's what it is.
Liam was saying how much he stands in awe of your work.
I know that, but
That's true. I was here.
there we go.
It's true.
I'm also curious again when speaking to creators, is there, just because I'm very much a kid at heart when it comes to intaking this kind of content, because it's something that I came to as a child and have that kind of childlike passion for. And I'm wondering if there's something that you as creators of particular, doesn't have to be Justice League, we can go to the breadth of your work, a particular storyline you wish you could see in as big a medium as this massive blockbuster that we just came out, but you know would never get made. Something that you were just...
The one that got away?
What?
The one that got away?
Yeah, yeah.
First.
No, you go. You take this one.
Well, actually,
No, you're all going to take this one. It's not
yeah. For a while there, when Andy Helfer was editing the Justice League book, I knew that I wanted to send the Justice League to hell. I wanted them to go to hell and wind up fighting for their souls by playing Twister with the devil for the souls of the Justice League. And Andy Helfer told me, no way. As long as I'm editing the book, you're never doing that. It's never going to happen. And then a couple of years later, we did a book called, I think it was, I Can't Believe It's Not the Justice League, wherein I just didn't tell the editor and actually got to do it. So all my Justice League stories have been told. Thank you.
I think there's a point where you think you've told all your stories about any particular character, Justice League or otherwise, and then there's a new one that pops in some way, somehow. I think I've gotten to do, whoa. Okay. I think I've gotten to do most of what I wanted, yes. So, but there's always new stuff that appears, and a lot of it is, it's always like the smallest idea. It's, you know, you'll see a story about a satellite, 20 million light years away or something like that, and somehow that'll turn into a story that's right for the Justice League. So I never say that I've gotten to do everything, because I always hope there's going to be more tomorrow.
The story I'm doing at the moment, The Brave and the Bold, is kind of a dream project. It's all set in basically Tir na Nog, which is the Irish fairyland.
Would you mind giving us a little bit of background on The Brave and the Bold?
Sorry?
Could you give us a little bit of background on The Brave and the Bold?
So it's a launch, it's a new 6-issue series. I'm writing and drawing it. It's Batman and Wonder Woman in Tir na Nog. Like I say, it's sort of all Celtic mythology. And I'm just really excited about it. In terms of your question, the dream would be for it to be like a trilogy and a lot more of the Justice League characters to be put into that environment. I mean, and in terms of it being the one that got away, I never thought I'd get to do this. So it's actually happening. It didn't really get away.
I didn't understand a word you said. I'm sorry.
Daniel, I liked what you said about sort of these tiny kernels of stories expanding into something that eventually could become something right for Justice League. Can you expand upon that a little bit? Like, are there any other anecdotes you have of small ideas that just exploded into something that you couldn't have possibly seen coming when it happened? Is that a typical...
You mean in terms of story that I've actually done that way?
Yeah, I'd be curious.
I know that it involved the Justice League, but one of the things that has always bugged me, earlier I mentioned the Justice League as sort of being Earth's last line of defense. And one of the things that always bugs me a little bit about superhero comics typically is they'll say, and to boil it down to a very simple thought, alien invasion is coming. As soon as New York is half destroyed, we'll go fight them. And I know that rather than do it that way, I had Superman corral everybody up and say, we're going to go meet them before they get here, which I think would be a much more heroic and practical sort of response. It's like, yeah, thanks. Let's not destroy half of New York or all of it before we kind of sound the alarm.
But in a way, that's what traffic.
But in a way, that's what we all want. I mean, that's a very simple idea, which is instead of waiting until my house is half burned down, let's have the fire department there right away, or let's have the cops there before the guy gets past the front door, right? And I think those are the very small types of ideas that can turn into a much bigger story.
As I was going to say, you can't, the Justice League or you know, superhero teams like it, it's like them, they can't really be used as a prophylactic, like as a preventative measure for this kind of event, because then what would they do, I suppose? It's like usually you do kind of need the threat, you need the actual event to happen, you need the actual destruction to happen, and so you can have this kind of exciting, dramatic...
Right. Well, at that point, with what you describe, it's sort of like that's where you go over the line and you're going to do Justice League fascism. You know, and it's like, okay, they'll stop everything from happening immediately, including a riot in the street or some form of self-expression or something. So there's always that line that you kind of want to walk to make it work.
Well, it's weird. Listening to your question, I suddenly realized that we never really worked like that on Justice League. We would just come up with this weird idea, and I would throw it into the plot, and Mark DeMatteis would then riff on it. He'd throw it back to me. So it was never any overwhelming idea, like you say, aliens coming to Earth. It was usually some ridiculous thing, like what would happen if Blue Beetle tried to pick up a girl and it went wrong. And the whole story would grow out of that. And I'd put it down, Mark would expand on it, I'd visit the next issue. So I wasn't really working so much off of plot and dialogue as just throwing down ideas, just riffing on the book. What about you? Not that we'll understand the word you say.
Yeah, I missed most of it. It's weird writing and drawing at the same time. I try to be in to wear two different hats. So when I'm thinking about the script, I try not to think about what I like to draw. So otherwise, I'd make it too easy on myself. So I want to, you know, I'll finish the script, then I'll send it to myself, then I'll look at my script and go, damn, this guy's giving me really hard things to draw. I hate this writer, you know. But the writing process is interesting, where ideas come from, you know. I mean, a threat is always important. In this case, it's a murder, but behind the murder is a big threat. There's always the layers, and you have to have some sense of a payoff. But often it, like, you know, Keith was saying, it's like a simple idea will kick the whole thing forward.
How much of is it appealing to creators like yourselves to get to kind of work on these massive universe blend stories where you have a bunch of iconic characters, or does it add, I know, Liam, you were talking about a bit of pressure that applies to you in working on this, on something that's been so iconic that you've idolized so much. Is it a lot of pressure writing for more big characters when you basically have a ton of principal people and not a ton of supporting people? Does that make it easier? Does it make it more difficult, more complicated, less enjoyable?
Well, the difficulty and the pressure kind of come in from the standpoint that if you're doing Justice League, all those characters are appearing in their own titles, many of them in more than one. And the pressure comes in from the awareness that you always want to, you know you can only go so far. It's going to be like, you can't say, okay, I'm going to do this 12-issue arc where Batman joins a convent. You know, it's like, no, the regular Batman writer probably doesn't want to do that. And so there's the pressure from trying to find a way to make the stories interesting, even though in some cases you can't really do a lot of character development, because that's going to be held for their own title.
You couldn't possibly kill Superman, for instance.
No.
Absolutely right.
No, wait, whoa. The basic thing, when you do these team books, especially in Justice League, and you had more experience in dealing with established characters than I did, but the basic agreement was, we'll take Green Lantern, we'll tell a Green Lantern story. Whatever we do to him in the story, we will give him back to you in the same condition you gave him to us in. Right. So that's how these team books manage to keep the character interesting within the team dynamic without screwing up what's going on in the regular book.
Yeah. And the reason that I was able to kill Superman in the Justice League is because the writer and artist on Superman was really a great individual. and he cooperated very well with me, and can't say enough good things about him.
We were just speaking about that earlier today, and I remember that moment being on Entertainment Tonight. Like, that moment in comics was so iconic that it actually like made it super mainstream. It was on Entertainment Tonight, and I was like, I remember that being, thanks for that. It was very incredible.
Yeah. Yes, it was.
So how do you deal with, I find it very difficult when doing an ensemble piece not to have there be some kind of internal conflict. So how have you all balanced how have you all balanced the inevitable internal conflict that there can be within a team like the Justice League, which is obviously a lot of very strong personalities, versus the external conflict necessary to bring them all together? Is that something that you enjoy writing, or is it something that you kind of prefer to have an external focus? And
with a book like Justice League or any of the team books that have characters that are appearing in other books, that have characters in solo books, your best bet's not even to think of that. You try to tell a story about the group dynamic. You set up the group dynamic and have things happen to that. In a Justice League book, you cannot turn Superman into a murderer because he's going back into his own book. There are people that read the Superman book. You owe a certain amount of respect to the teams that are on the individual books. So with my take on team books has always been find something that can affect the team, but not the individuals on the team. And I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's really the only way to do it.
You know, I've always been intrigued by the fact that when the Justice League first appeared, if we go back to their very first appearance in Brave and Bold and then into their own title, they didn't even know each other's secret identities. And I thought that was awesome, because at that point, the only way you got them together was by that very overt plot mechanism. And I just thought something about that was so cool, that here are these people, you know, they're all hanging out and they're, you know, doing all this stuff, and they don't even know who each other is, which I think that's kind of a fun thing. It would be fun to try and pull off a story that way.
Well, yeah, and you have to figure that when you're doing a group book, especially a book that has a lot of characters that have individual titles, continuity, you can't do it in a team book. You can't have any continuity except as the characters are relating to the team. You can't do anything major in Superman's life in a Justice League book because he's got his own book. You've got to find ways of making the Justice League interesting in and of itself and have those events transpire. You've got to be aware of the fact that these characters are kind of on loan to you.
In terms of the team dynamic, how have you seen that evolve? The particular dynamic with the particular, I don't know. This is going to be a question for you, Keith, because I'm going to reference the current team in the film. But the current team in the film has appeared in many, many, many iterations throughout the last several decades. How have you seen that dynamic evolve as we've changed as a society, or have you seen it at all aside from
Has the film evolved?
Say that again?
So I'm curious to know, since you guys have been kind of present with Justice League for decades before this film has evolved, I'm curious to know how their team dynamic, which is something that's obviously important in a team book, how it's evolved to what we've got now in 2017 with this movie.
I think they have more faults now, and they're a little more human. Really, when you go back to when the Justice League of America first appeared, they were much more godlike. I mean, they were all perfect in their own ways, and it would have been, you know, in the Justice League film, there's a scene where Aquaman walks out of the bar and he tosses the whiskey bottle or whatever it was aside and everything, and that scene would have been inconceivable if you go back to 1962, for example. And so they were all on such pedestals that they were virtually artificial beings. I mean, there was nothing real about them at all. And I think what we've seen through all of them, and we've seen this in their personal relationships, they have become more human despite their power levels, and in some cases they have faults that we did not used to see.
Is your microphone broken?
Yours is.
Yeah, I think so. Yep. Yeah, no. So I completely agree. Really, it does seem like we can tell stories that are more naturalistic in the way they behave, given that they are superheroes, you know.
Do you think there's a danger of that going too far? And do you think of like, so how dark would you like to see this get, Keith, or how human?
It's a comic book. You can't go too far, and if you go too far, you can undo it because it's a comic book.
Let's put it this way. There was a storyline back in the 90s in which Hal Jordan pretty much went nuts and killed all the Guardians of the Galaxy, right? I mean, he killed everybody in sight, and they replaced him with a character named Kyle Rayner. If you can find your way out of that and rehabilitate Hal Jordan and make him a hero again after he has killed all those people, Keith is right. It's comics. You can find your way out of whatever trap you put yourself in.
I've always said that when you see a hero die, fans get upset because, oh, the hero's dead. What are you going to do now? And in comics, it's as easy as doing the next issue and the hero walks in the door and goes, did I miss anything? It's a comic book. And while it's good to, you want to have cohesive stories, you want fans to get into the characters. If I kill Booster Gold tomorrow, Dan can bring him back the day after, and it'll work because it's a comic book.
That's the same for like relationships as well, because a lot of people get really obsessed with the relationships of the characters.
Right.
Yeah.
Who do you think is, what are some of the more underrated or underserved members of the Justice League that we don't see represented as much? Maybe this question would be more for you, Keith, since I know that you worked on a team that wasn't as widely known, but...
I didn't catch that at all.
I know, I'm sorry. Guys, we apologize. We have a hard time hearing actually on the stage. I'm curious to know what you folks feel are some of the, I guess, less mainstream Justice League members over the course of the series history or the comics history that have been a little bit more underserved in adaptations.
To be honest with you, I don't even think about that. I mean, the characters that show up in movies, it's great to see their interpretation of the character, but it's their interpretation of the character. It's not the way it would be, 9 times out of 10, it's not the way it would be done in comics, certainly not the way I would do it. And my take on it is, I really, if I wanted the character done a certain way, then I would do the character a certain way. I don't understand people who go, that's not Batman, that's not the way I do it. Well, obviously you didn't do it. So I think it's just when you take on a character, you do the best you can, but then if Hollywood comes along and makes a movie and it's not quite the way you saw the character, it's none of your business. That's the way they saw it, and that's what's coming out.
Yeah, I think Keith is right, but what's interesting right now is that we are seeing virtually everything translated to screen, either television or a movie screen, one way or another. And we have, I never thought we would ever get to the point where the elongated man would turn into a recurring character that I could see on TV almost every week. But yet, here we are, and we're seeing that with a lot of different characters, and it's some work better than others. Some of that is just because of special effects. Other times it's because the interpretation of that character doesn't necessarily match what was on the page, or certainly not my concept of what might have been on the page. But the beauty of it is now, we are seeing everybody, really, just about every single character show up on TV or on film one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that there's 2 Flashes out there on the TV and the film version, and they're really, really different as well, and both sort of work in different ways.
Right. Yeah, it's true. And they have the same name. They're both Barry Allen, yet they are very, very different characters and are certainly interact with the casts around them in a very different way as well.
We just mentioned something that got me thinking about the incredible advances in CGI that have not only made these massive comic book blockbusters, superhero blockbusters possible, but they've made them really interesting and palatable. And I'm wondering how you feel about the presentation of these movies visually. Has it impressed you? Has it stunned you? Or do you prefer more practical effects? Or
I don't know. I've always heard it said, and I've heard many people say it, that if you do something in a comic book that they have a real problem adapting to the screen, you've succeeded. We're a totally different medium, we're a totally different storytelling approach, but we're not limited by budget. We're limited by just the imagination. If you can put it down on paper, you can get it in a comic book. So, yeah, when it comes to when it comes to the films, as many problems I may have with some of the films, they're limited. They're limited by what they're capable of doing. We're not.
I think back to the original Superman movie, the Christopher Reeves one, and all the issues they had with him flying and setting up those rigs and the screen and the color of his costume and all of that and the cape, how that was going to work. There's definitely been improvements, you know, there's definitely been improvement. It's great seeing, you know, so many of these characters believably doing things, you know, whether it's underwater, you know, it's great seeing Aquaman sort of believably underwater. I liked that they made him fly and not swim. It would have, his arms would have been going around like just ridiculously. You know. I don't have to always know the kind of science behind the methods of propulsion for it to look cool. But I thought he was. I'm very keen to see the Aquaman movie. Momoa was just fantastic in it. So, you know, I'm all for it. If it's done well, it should be invisible.
Yeah, I agree with that. To close here, we've got just a few minutes left. So I'm curious to know, we always seem to look at comic books and comic book movies through the lens of how the source material affects the film and how the film is related to the source material, starting with the source material. I'm curious to know, since we've basically entered we're hitting almost a decade of really, really fabulous blockbuster superhero films, how you've seen those films affect comic books.
Badly.
That's a little broad, but
Badly. I think whenever the films affect the comic books, you're going to suffer for it because, again, the comic books aren't restricted by budget, and I think that to take the Justice League comic now and try to make it as much like the Justice League movies as possible, you're just cutting off all kinds of story ideas, all kinds of venues. We don't have a budget. We can blow up Earth. If you do it in the movies, you have a budget. It costs a bit more. So, no, keep them separate. Keep them separate.
I bounce back and forth on that one because I think there are things that could be gained, and I think it depends a little bit on what the objective would be. So, for example, if you wanted to use the Avengers movies, because there's been a couple of those, or Justice League, or whatever you want to use, and said, we want to use this as a vehicle to attract new readers, and we're going to put a photo cover on every single issue, and we're going to push it out there and make it like the movie because that's what people are interested in. That was perhaps their first exposure. Then I think that becomes a worthwhile attempt to try and do that. On the flip side, if you're working on issue 237 of Justice League, where it's like he says, we can do anything you want, and you have your own cast and crew, and you have your cadre of bad guys and everything else, and you've kind of built up to that point, why would you deviate? Then just keep doing what they're doing. So I think it depends on what the goal is, but I think there's room for both approaches.
Yeah, I can't really add much to that.
well, on that note, thank you so much, gentlemen. We incredibly appreciate your presence.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, folks.